David Collins.
Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a kingdom far across the sea.
Behold my latest culinary sensation, peanut butter sandwich!
Whoa, that's our cue to exit. Now it's time to rock and roll.
Certified by the border folk, I've been called down here to help you out. Hey, where did everybody go?
Gentlemen, start your engines.
And both teams look solid for today's matchup. Wow, what a spectacular game.
You're in Vacaville.
Welcome to Horrorville.
And you're listening to P-A-R-K.
And you're in Pirateville.
I'm hugging a giant redwood right now. Oh, I love the strong, silent type. A little old for me, though.
Welcome to Bombard Radio, David Collins. Or do you want to go by David W. Collins? I don't know.
David's fine. I just, you know, it's funny that the W just happens because David Collins is such a common name that I just put a W in there just so I could find an email address. You know, it's one of those kind of things. And when I first joined the Actors Union, I said, "Oh, my name's David Collins." And they said, "Taken. What's your middle initial?" And I said, "W." And they're like, "Okay, you're David W. Collins." And I said, "Okay." You know, I feel like the middle initial seems so pretentious, but like I wouldn't get a Twitter feed with or a Twitter handle without it. You know.
Well, lots of voice actors use three names. You know, James Arnold Taylor.
James Arnold Taylor, yes.
He has three first names.
C. Bradley Baker.
Yep.
Tom Yoda Kane.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we might as well just start off right away. You worked as a sound designer for LucasArts, and now you work as a lead sound designer and a voice director, I believe, for Sony, right?
I do work for Sony PlayStation. I'm actually a sound and voice manager, which is, and the reason I make the distinction is because my job has kind of shifted to kind of assisting a lot of other really talented sound designers and dialogue coordinators and in doing their work as well as doing production work myself. So, yeah, I moved to Sony and started doing management, and so we've got a whole department of sound and dialogue people that work on all kinds of stuff. And I just kind of run around making sure that everything's happening and no one's hair is catching on fire and all of that. But, yeah.
So basically you help coordinate like the voice actors or the people recording that and the sound mixers and sound editors to make sure it all works.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the really unglamorous part is, you know, we make sure that all the scheduling and budgeting and stuff is done. But really the fun stuff is we deal with actors, you know, doing performance capture, motion capture, voiceover, likeness capture, movement, any of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, sound design. And sound design has been, you know, because I'm a huge fan of Ben Burt and Gary Rydstrom and Randy Tom and all of those guys, you know, that Walter Murch, all those guys that invented sound design as a word. I mean, that word wasn't really used until the 70s, you know, by Walter Murch and Ben Burt. But the sound design in games is just so important, you know, and it's a lot of work. It's very detailed and tedious work. You touch everything from animation to visual effects to, you know, levels and ambience, gameplay, weapons. I mean, you name it. So, yeah, it's basically the sound that comes out of the speakers, you know, and it's really fun once you get into it. But, yeah, it's a lot of trial and error, a lot of work, but it's very satisfying when something comes out and you're just so proud of it at the end.
Now, this is a subject which really fascinates me because at one time I wanted to be a filmmaker and tried to get in a film school for directing and writing and didn't get in. But then I realized, you know, after I, you know, tried getting in that I really liked sound, and so I started doing podcasting and so on. So sound fascinates me, like, you know, how people make sounds, how the mixing all happens, because for me, I grew up listening to radio dramas. I grew up listening to old-time radio shows and so on. So I learned to listen. Honestly, I listened to Star Wars before I saw Star Wars. I listened to the radio show before I ever saw the movies. And so
cool.
I learned
the
to
Brian
listen
Daly,
to everything.
Do you mean the Brian Daly shows, the BBC shows?
Yep.
Or, yeah, those are great.
The Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, and then when I turned like 8 or 9. No, I was 9 or maybe 10 when Return of the Jedi came out.
Yeah. Yeah.
96.
Yeah, those are amazing with Brock Peters. And John Lithgow as Yoda.
And Perry.
Perry King.
As
Perry King?
Han Solo.
As Han Solo, yep. Yeah, those are amazing.
they were definitely amazing, and so that started my liking of sound. So I guess the first question I'm gonna have for you is, you talk about being a sound manager, and you just worked on The Last of Us, a game which, well, basically to everyone is the best game on the PlayStation 3, which, having played it, has an amazing sound mix and so on. So why don't you tell the fans a little bit about what goes into creating that mix of sound that people went through, and what was like working with, say, Troy Baker and all these people that worked together to make this game, well, it could be the swan song, or at least the epitome of what the Sony PlayStation can do.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd want to say is that I should introduce you to Phil Kovacs, who is the audio lead of that game. I mean, he really is the guy that it's funny because he actually had my job at Sony PlayStation before he moved over to Naughty Dog, and then because he moved over, that job opened up and I took it. But Phil really set the bar incredibly high with the team there, and is really the creative force that drove all of that stuff with Neil Druckmann and the team. And and along with that is a friend of mine that I work with, and his name is Derek Espino. There's these two guys really kind of set the bar high. But I could go on just naming a ton of people. Mike Niederquell and Eric Ocampo and all kinds of people that worked on this thing. And there was an army of people working on sound for this game, and my role was to basically help supply that army, and then towards the end I jumped in myself and did some sound design myself, and did a lot of coordinating for just even covering sound recording on the mocap stage. And I know Troy is a really unbelievably talented actor, and he's a great musician. And actually the first time I ever worked with Troy was cast him as a character in a Clone Wars game in 2009. So Troy was actually in the Clone Wars. He was a character called Kulteska, which was kind of the bad guy in that game. And I had never heard of him. I just, he was kind of new. He'd moved from Dallas, and his agent, Becky Dodd, she said, this guy is really great. You got to check him out. And he did one or two takes, and he was amazing. And then he just blew up in everything. It's amazing that he is in BioShock Infinite, and he's in The Last of Us, and they both came out kind of at the same time, and people don't realize it's the same guy.
And he's the Joker.
And he's the Joker.
Batman Origins.
Yeah, and Batman Origins, Arkham Origins.
Those are big shoes. Might be Arkham Origins, but those are big shoes to fill. My goodness.
Oh, yeah, incredible. I just loved Mark Hamill in those. I was obsessed with both of those two games, so I can't wait for Arkham Origins or Batman Origins, whatever it may be. Where's Google when you need it?
The one before Arkham Asylum.
Exactly. Origins, the origin story. But yeah, from what I heard from that trailer, he's going to be amazing. And just being on set with him and Ashley and Neil and the whole crew, you could tell. And Nolan North is in that game. He plays the character David in that game. And people don't know it's him because he's doing this other voice. But Nolan was on set too, and just watching those guys work, it's just incredible. And it really is like they were making a film, and it's tricky to say that because obviously the game is what's really important, and story is in service of the game, but the story was so important and it informed gameplay, and the gameplay was so purpose-driven in that game. It's such a new experience for the video game genre in general, to be that cinematic, to be that powerful in terms of a story, Walking Dead felt that way to me too. There's just what's going on right now in games, and it's almost like genre busting. We think of video games in a very specific way, and I think that people who don't play video games think of them in a very specific game, and then games like The Last of Us come along and just totally shatter those expectations and say, well, games can also be this. They can also be this really beautiful, character-driven, tragic, wonderful story. That's also incredibly satisfying to play. The gunplay is great, the combat's great, the crafting's really fun. I first heard about that game when I first started at Sony. I just left LucasArts in 2011, and I heard Naughty Dog was doing something other than Uncharted, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be amazing. And every time I saw it, I was just blown away. And the guys just poured their hearts and souls into the thing, especially on the sound end of things. I would go in and Derek Espino would play me, hey, these are recordings I did in order to create these special explosions for a Molotov cocktail, you know, or what they did with the clickers, you know, or any of these sounds that they were doing, and the level of subtlety, you know, that they were going for, and dynamic range and everything. It was just really, really fun to be a part of it, and just kind of have a front row seat for that creative process.
And when it came to The Last of Us, you know, it got praised for basically on every level, but especially for voice acting, sound design. There's even a lot of the game where you have to, you know, do the visual representation of sound in order to find people. And the way because this, you know, the game doesn't have a lot of pieces, but the sound is such an important part of this game that without it, this game would not be the same. Even the soundtrack by forgot his name, Gustavo, who did he has like 2 Academy Awards or something like that.
Yeah, Gustavo. I'm going to butcher his last name. Santuela. Yeah, he did. Yeah, amazing soundtrack. And his first game, you know, and the music department there at Sony really does a great job of harnessing the top talent and bringing them in. And there's a group of people that basically take those music tracks and they put them in the game and help spot it with the director, and they're such a high-class group. And then as far as the listen mode, that's, you know, there's a guy there. They have a full-time sound programmer there at Naughty Dog named Jonathan Lanier that just sits there. The guy's a genius, and he just writes this code to, you know, do all kinds of ray casting and occlusion and obstruction, so that if something's behind an object, you hear it filter. The custom reverbs to define the spaces you're in, because when you have that level of subtlety and you're sneaking around, those details are so important. It's core to gameplay, you know, and there's some great stuff on the web. They did a Soundworks collection video that is really awesome that kind of interviews those guys. People should check it out. But yeah, I can't say enough great things about that crew and the amount of love and work they put into that game.
And from the fans' perspective, that game is, well, all the work that went into it is well worth it, because it paid off in spades.
Awesome.
So you have a background in music. You actually, as I recall, you have a degree in music that includes guitar, conducting, and so on. Yeah.
I took voice, and I took conducting, and I took all kinds of stuff. You know, I played. It's funny. I was a drummer and a singer, and then when I moved to Boston, I kind of got lazy, and because you had to set your drums up to practice, and I had a guitar, and I started playing more and more guitar, and that's also the time when I was studying, you know, sound, and then from there got an internship at Skywalker Ranch right out of school on their scoring stage. So my first job with Lucasfilm was being an engineer's assistant working on these big orchestral film scores for the first year at Skywalker Ranch, and that was incredibly eye-opening. It was right after The Phantom Menace was released in theaters. So, you know, the other half of the building was still mixing all of the localized versions, you know, the international versions of The Phantom Menace, because it wasn't released at one time like it is now. It was released at later dates, you know. And Toy Story 2 was going on, and I worked a little on that. I did the score for Inspector Gadget. You know, that was my first week in the workforce, was working on this Disney movie. I must have heard that
the Matthew Broderick one?
The Matthew Broderick one, yeah. With John Debney was a composer, and that was the first thing I worked on, and it was like such a mind-blowing experience, because it was a 120-piece orchestra, and you know, they were still using tape, but they were also using Pro Tools and other digital recorders they were trying out. The whole technology behind sound was changing at that time. I was at Skywalker at a time where I saw the old reel-to-reel mag machines slowly be removed by sort of this intermediary digital machines, you know, these Tascam machines, which eventually all became Pro Tools. Like it took a while for digital to kind of find its pipeline, you know, but I mean, I was there to watch all of that happen in the central machine room and on the scoring stage, and it's amazing how much technology has changed in the last 14, 15 years. I mean, it seems like ancient history now. And I remember being in school with a friend of mine that I actually work with now at Sony, and we were in school together, and we had to splice analog tape, and he was saying, why are we doing this? We're never going to do this in the workforce, which is not necessarily true, because some rock bands still track to 2-inch tape because they love that sound. But It is true in that, I mean, everything's digital, everything's computers, and it was interesting being there at that time watching that happen.
So has your background in music, which you still continue to do, of course, has it helped you positively with your sound recording career? And if so, in what ways has it affected your sound design, sound recording, and voice acting career?
That's a great question. You know, I think it's definitely all linked in my mind. It's when you have music, when you have acting, drama, sound design, post-production, mixing, anything, to me they're all kind of the same. I mean, language has a rhythm to it. It has tone, it has timbre, and it's got all of those elements that are all, in my mind, very musical. So I don't really make a distinction. I guess it's just a weird way my brain works. Is, you know, when I think about where to place a sound in something, in a particular scene, or where to swell a certain effect, you know, in order to get maximum impact, if I'm mixing a cinematic or something like that. To me, that process, you're doing it for dramatic impact, but that process is very musical to me. It's a very creative process. One of my favorite things that I've seen in when mixers do this, you know, when sound mixers put things together, like let's say in a movie, is they do things in order to heighten the drama. They'll swell the music, or they'll pull stuff out. Like I remember the first time I really noticed this was when I saw Attack of the Clones, and you know, one of the mixers on that is this guy Gary Rydstrom, who, if you know your listeners look him up, he's won so many Oscars for, you know, Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park and all these things. You know, he pulls everything down to nothing right before the moment of a giant explosion, and it's so subtle that you don't realize that everything's dropped out, because it's that moment of oh crap right before the big thing happens that actually makes that thing seem even bigger than it really is. So you don't have to.
Is this the sonic boom explosion?
That's kind of actually, that's really similar. That's actually different. That's actually, you know what? That's actually an even better example than what I was thinking of.
Because that's my favorite sound effect in all of film.
Right, and
and then in Jurassic Park, the T-Rex roar is probably my second favorite. But that sonic boom is my favorite sound I've ever heard on a film set.
Well, the T-Rex is Gary Rydstrom. The sonic boom in the asteroid sequence in Attack of the Clones is Ben Burtt, and that the idea of creating this vacuum is a very daring idea. It's the same idea I actually was thinking, and that's such a better example. Thank you. The example I was thinking of is at one point during the Clone Wars on the Battle of Geonosis, there's this rocket that kind of flies past camera and hits this tank, and the tank explodes. And right before the rocket explodes, there's this microsecond of nothing that just, it goes by so fast, but I noticed it because, you know, when you're mixing, you only have so much volume you can play with, especially in a video game. You know, if you make everything super loud, then, you know, the neighbors hate it. You know, your parents ask you to turn it down, all that kind of stuff. You don't have the same level of loudness, what we call dynamic range, to play with in a home theater or on a television that you do in a movie theater where it's a controlled environment. You can blow people's hair back. But yeah, Ben Burtt's thing, well, that's the same principle. You know, to give that sound its moment to shine, everything dropped out ahead of it. So you build this anticipation in the viewer or in the listener, and suddenly like something amazing happens, you know, and it's very satisfying. The payoff is really satisfying.
And judging from your list of credits, you seem like the only person who's worked on more LucasArts games than you would be Tom Kane, who's been in basically every LucasArts game ever made.
Yeah, or my boss at the time. Yeah, I definitely worked on a lot of them. But yeah, Tom, I knew about Tom from my boss Dara O'Farrell at the time, who was the head of all things voice and was directing all the games when I started at LucasArts. You know, he did not just the Star Wars stuff, but the adventure games like Monkey Island and Grim Fandango and all that kind of stuff. But Tom was this guy. I was like, who's this Tom Kane guy? He's in everything, you know. And he was doing C-3PO, he was doing Yoda, he was doing soldiers, he was doing Imperial officers, he was doing everything. And then eventually, you know, he got into the Clone Wars microseries, and then after a while, I started hearing him in trailers, and now he's just everywhere. You know, he's on every trailer, every commercial. You know, you see the Walmart commercial, it's Tom Kane. Yeah, a lot of Star Wars games. I think from 2000 to 2011, I did, I think, dozens of Star Wars games, and many of which, you know, kind of came and went, but some of them were really, really memorable and fun.
So by the looks of it, looks like your first Star Wars game was Star Wars Demolition in 2000, followed by Starfighter. So what was it like growing up as a Star Wars fan and finding yourself actually working on a Star Wars game, not just in the ranch, like you were before, but actually working on a Star Wars game with the Star Wars sound effects available to you? What was it like to know that you were working on part of Star Wars?
Oh man, yeah, I remember those days really well. So my first week at LucasArts was in June of 2000, and they showed me the sound effects library and said, "Oh, you access it this way." And I spent probably, I never stopped listening, but my first week was just solid, just clicking through everything and just listening to everything in isolated elements, and reading descriptions about what they were, how they were recorded, or what the source was. And I remember just right when I started, before I was even assigned to anything, it's actually, I've never told this story before, but right before I was assigned to anything, I had just started, and I was an assistant, I fired up Pro Tools and just created a lightsaber battle with music and footsteps and grunts and lightsaber impacts and swings and background. I just went for it because I was so enthralled by all these sounds that I was hearing and playing with, and not to mention, we had just gotten a huge delivery of sounds from Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and one of my first jobs was just listening and typing descriptions for all that stuff. Say what you want about The Phantom Menace, there was so much incredible sound in that movie. There was just so much design that Ben Burtt covered, and that was an incredible lesson. So I feel like I was playing in Ben's backyard for a decade. And when I first started Demolition, it felt great to be working on Star Wars. I was processing, I remember trying to make a voice actor sound like Jabba and doing all these kind of things. And that was a PlayStation 1 game, so the fidelity was incredibly low compared to what we have now. And trying to make it all fit in memory. And actually, that was the first time I ever did a voiceover gig for Star Wars. They didn't have enough source material for the Salacious Crumb and the Jabba the Hutt cinematics that were in that game, so I ended up laughing like Salacious Crumb, and they pitched it up, and that shipped in the game. So yeah, just that I guess that was the beginning of all of it. Starfighter was amazing. I loved that game. That was kind of the first time that I really took a chunk out of the work that needed to be done, and made quite a few sounds for that game.
And then, of course, this led up to at least the first, after Shadows of the Empire, the first massively massive Star Wars game that I recall was Star Wars Galaxies, at least as far as how big they wanted to make this game.
Right.
And you were one of the sound designers in that game. So when you were first told about this game, what they had in mind, what was the first thing that went through your head, and then how do you think you did on that?
Yeah, well, that's that game was never stopped. That game was constantly in production for sound from when I started all the way up until, I guess all the way up until I left LucasArts. That game was still going, and then they shut it down a little while ago. But when I first started, they said, okay, there's this game called Starfighter, there's this game called Monkey Island, there's a game called Demolition, and then there are these other top secret games that are coming down. There's this one that's an MMO RPG, and then there's one that's just an RPG. And I was like, whoa, because they called them MMO RPGs back then, instead of just MMOs. And I was like, what? Oh, and there's an RTS, which was Battlegrounds. There were all these different, and then there's all these FPSs. They were using all of these different abbreviated nicknames for things, and I just was going, wait, what is all this? There were so many games in production. And of course, the RPG ended up being Knights of the Old Republic, which I think even back then in 2000 had its title, and we knew that was in the early stages. And then there was this thing, Galaxies, which was, they said, it's kind of like EverQuest. And I said, oh, okay. I hadn't really played an MMO before, and I'm not really what you would call an MMO guy. I wasn't the lead on Galaxies. I was a different guy named Todd Davies, but I worked on it for a few months and got pulled off in order to do a game called Bounty Hunter, which I worked on a lot. But Galaxies I was only on for a couple of months. I did a lot of creature sounds, and then I ended up doing some downloadable weapon sounds later on. And those weapon sounds, it's funny because I made so many, and many of them weren't used. I ended up reusing them in games like Force Unleashed and Republic Commando and things like that because I had made so many for Galaxies. There were just, I mean, the list was overwhelming of how many creatures that needed to be made for that game, how many different assets needed to be made, that all need to sound like Star Wars, but they don't exist in Star Wars, or at least they didn't exist in the films. You know, so you're making all this stuff that's trying to fit in that Ben Burt Star Wars wheelhouse that sounds like the movies. And then, of course, you'd read the reviews, and they're like, oh, it sounds great. They pulled all the sound straight from the movies. And that's like the best compliment you can get, and also totally infuriating at the same time, because you're like, but I put 3 years into this, or whatever it is, you know. But it is a great compliment, because you are using those very famous sounds, and then you're also mixing in a lot of your own and going out and recording stuff that you're hoping sounds similar. But Galaxies was huge, and it just went on for years.
Were you able to see or log into Galaxies anytime just before the end to see how much the users themselves had changed that the game that started off as one thing, and then the users just ran with it and created entire cities and groups on their own over a decade?
I hate to say it, but I didn't. I mean, I have some really, really close friends that were playing it. In fact, my friend, the person that told me the most about this is the honest truth. The person that kept me the most updated on Galaxies was Sam Witwer. Because he's a huge LucasArts fan, and that's how we met back in 2000, 2001, something like that. He went to Juilliard with my best friend growing up, my friend Patrick, and he loved LucasArts and just wanted to talk about it. And when he said, hey, my friend David works there, we ended up just becoming friends even before he, moved back to California, I believe. And we chatted forever, and he talked about Galaxies all the time. And so all my friends were on Galaxies, but I was already off working on something else. And in fact, when Galaxies was in its heyday, I was really deep into Republic Commando, because Republic Commando and Force Unleashed are the two games I would say that I probably left the biggest mark on, probably in my career, because those games. There was one sound guy on Republic Commando for most of that experience, and that was just me. It was a small team that was on it for a long time. So I was on that game from December 2002 until it shipped, basically.
One sound person for all the sound in that game?
For a while, and then what happened was towards the end, I was like, I'm drowning, I need help. But for the first year and a half, I would say it was just me. And then I got budget to go record Foley, and then I got budget to get some friends to work on it towards the end. But it really was just I was just kind of doing everything myself, and that's kind of how games were. It was when I started, and then it kind of changed throughout the 2000s. Like games became big budget, big money pieces of entertainment, but when I started, they were much smaller. And Republic Commando is kind of, it was like pushing into that, it was moving into that. And I was young enough to feel guilty for asking for help, and it was one person on dialogue, one person on music, who was Jesse Harlan, the composer, and one person on sound, and that was me. And I was also directing the dialogue in the studio. So that became a very personal expression of what I thought was cool in a Star Wars FPS, And then later with The Force Unleashed, that was a totally different experience, because I had since learned to ask for help. And there were probably about 12 to 20 of us, if you count all the engineers and all the people at Skywalker working on it. And I mean, there was a small army working on The Force Unleashed, because that was such a big budget cinematic title.
So I guess a couple of questions about Force Unleashed, since that, at least in my memory, was one of the first, you could say, a AAA game that came out of LucasArts, because we had X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, we had Battlefront, all these games which a lot of people really played, but the Force Unleashed was one of the first ones that came out, and people were like, we all need to buy this game because it is that big of a game. So with the Force Unleashed, you said you had a lot of people working on it with you, and the team was really big. How should I put this? So, how long did that game actually take to do on your part? And by the end of it, because Force Unleashed 2, they rushed and so on. Did you guys actually have all the resources you need to actually finish the game the way you wanted it done?
That's a great question. So, the Force Unleashed 1 was actually a monumental undertaking for the company at that time. There was a new president that came on board. Named Jim Ward, and he was kind of charged with, okay, well, the prequels are done, and George is not going to make any more Star Wars movies. Where is Star Wars going to go after this? You know, George kind of quietly said, well, I'm thinking about retiring, and we had no idea, by the way, that Lucasfilm Animation was really kind of going on. We knew that there was an animation company forming, but, you know, we didn't know that the Clone Wars was going to happen, you know, everything that we know now. So LucasArts and what was going on with the games industry at that time was being looked at kind of carefully, you know, and Jim hatched this plan to basically say, well, what do people really want out of Star Wars? They want something epic. They want the hero's journey. They want something big. Let's start exploring these ideas. And that was as early, I think, as fall of 2004 and into 2005. But production didn't really start until, I don't know, 2006, and then was really in full steam in 2007. And originally it was supposed to come out in 2007. I mean, that's, you know, all the toys came out at that time, if you remember. And, you know, all the Hasbro toys came out in 2007. But we were given more time to finish it, which is great because there was this recognition from Jim Ward that it needed more time to kind of finish up, and we got it. And one of the nice things about that game is how much time we had to really work on the story, and we had input from George, and we had input from all kinds of people about what would be a good story and what wouldn't. And Hayden Blackman, the writer and you know, director of that game, he is just so talented, and really spent a lot of time. And I got to work on the story team just in sort of an advisory capacity on the first one, and have, you know, these late night conversations of Vader would never say that, he'd say this, you know, and someone arguing back like, no, I've written down everything that Vader said in all the movies. Sometimes he contracts his words, and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he says, you know, cannot, and sometimes he says can't, or something like that. And that's probably not the right example, but I mean, there were these very passionate people all trying to make something really cool on consoles that were new at the time. The PlayStation 3 hadn't even come out yet when we were working on this stuff. The Xbox was brand new, the Xbox 360, I mean. And we hired so many people because it was new technology, a new team, and a new game and a new story, new IP, new consoles. It was new everything. And we pushed through it and made something that we were really, really proud of. I mean, while it's not perfect, there were a lot of things that we, you know, wish we had time to address. I guess that's not really the point, you know, looking back on it. It's just that we got there and it was a new IP. You know, I compare it to Assassin's Creed. You know, the first Assassin's Creed crashed on me a few times, but it was really, really fun. You know, and they just kept going with those ideas. But yeah, I mean, The Force Unleashed, the story is something that I'm really proud of, and really glad I got to work with that team and work in the capacity that I did.
Okay, and you know, with me, I played both of them. I actually played what's probably known as the inferior version, the Wii version, but it's what I have. But like The Force Unleashed 2 is one which honestly I play more, but the biggest complaint, of course, is it seems like it's half a game. You know, it's a game that's cut in half, and it's definitely noticeably shorter than The Force Unleashed. Was The Force Unleashed 2 just a game that, was it actually rushed, or was it made to be the middle story, made to have a third part automatically in there, and they just never got a chance to make that third part?
Well, I mean, you know, first of all, in terms of the future of The Force Unleashed and a third part, I mean, you never know. You know as much as I do at this point. I mean, of course, LucasArts is no longer an internal studio, and The Force Unleashed as a franchise has the honor of being the last internally developed franchise that studio put out that was released. Of course, there was 1313, which we unfortunately never got to see, but there were just a lot of changes at LucasArts, and you know, as far as The Force Unleashed 2, I wish I could say more, but you know, there are a lot of things that I think were factors into why that game was shorter, and you know, there were a lot of changes in the company, and as we now know, everything's changed. You know, EA is doing those games, which I think, by the way, is a brilliant move for them to put out a Battlefront.
Nice.
I'm so excited for. I mean,
see Frostbite 2 engine doing Star Wars.
Yeah, and I promise exactly, and I promise to get back to Force Unleashed 2 in a second. But let me just say that you know, people who don't work in games, and they would have no way of knowing this, but games are software, you know, they're code, they're lines of code, they're assets being driven by a game engine, which is lines and lines of code and logic telling the game what to do. And games are unpredictable, they're buggy, and you learn things along the way. And a key to making games is iteration, right? If you think about the first huge Grand Theft Auto success, it was Grand Theft Auto 3 on the PlayStation 2. You know, they had made 2 before that, you know, some PC gamers played, but it wasn't the huge runaway success that Grand Theft Auto 3 was. The same is true with Blizzard. You know, you look at Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3, StarCraft 2. Eventually, all of their tech with their Diablo and Diablo 2, it all came together to create World of Warcraft. They had learned how to do these things over years and years of steady business, basically honing their craft on one discipline. Star Wars Battlefront, the original ones by Pandemic Studios, were very similar to that because they put out a game in 2002 called Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which had the same sort of open battlefield, jump in and out of vehicles type of gameplay. And all of those lessons led them to making Battlefront and Battlefront 2. So, you know, it takes a lot of know-how, a lot of talent, and a lot of trial and error to just suddenly make a game that was as amazing as Battlefront 2. So who better to do that right now than DICE? I mean, it's such a great move. I'm very, very excited. And Battlefront, putting out a Star Wars Battlefront is absolutely the right move because people can't wait for it. Anyway, that's just a little aside.
It might replace the Medal of Honor in their year-to-year when they release like Battlefield one year, then they release Medal of Honor the next year. It might replace Medal of Honor since Medal of Honor hasn't done very well in a while, and who wouldn't want new Star Wars games every 2 years?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's going to be, I think there's going to be a little bit of a dry spell. I mean, there is kind of a dry spell right now. You know, I mean, we have Star Wars Pinball, and we got Star Wars Angry Birds 2. You know, we've got some things that are happening, but we don't have those big console experiences that we were used to getting. And in fact, I mean, at one point, people were complaining there were too many Star Wars games. And that was something that the company tried to pull back and address as well, LucasArts back in the day. But yeah, Force Unleashed 2, I certainly don't think I'm saying anything that isn't completely obvious when I say, yeah, I think we all wish we had more time. There were just a lot of circumstances beyond the team's control, and wanted to make the best experience they could rather than make a long and crappy one with the resources that they had. And certainly the intention, and as you can tell by the story, is that it's left unfinished. And you know, it was part of this idea of like, oh yeah, well maybe someday. I mean, it's following the Empire Strikes Back model of you know, as Joss Whedon recently criticized it, said it doesn't have an ending, right? And some of that was intentional, but yeah, I mean, it was short. And it's funny because I put it out, and then I moved to Sony right after Force Unleashed 2 and Lego Star Wars 3 are the last 2 games that I did there. Oh, and The Old Republic. I worked on The Old Republic as well. But I played it when it came out, and then I hadn't seen it in a few years, and Sam and I were talking about it the other day, and I just went back to revisit it. And there's a lot of really great stuff in there. But yeah, I mean, certainly a team as passionate as the Force Unleashed team always would prefer to give you more.
Okay, so I guess I have a couple more questions, and so we're almost out of time. But so I guess one thing is with working with LucasArts, especially with a game like The Force Unleashed, you had to make a game that was able to run on PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Wii, Xbox 360, phones, DS, PSP, and computer, and so on. So what's it like switching from a company like LucasArts, where you have to make games that fit every model, to working for Sony, where pretty much you make games for, well, the Vita and the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 now? Do you like the switch where you're more focused on what certain devices can do rather than what everything can do?
Yeah, I will say that that what they call cross-platform development is extremely difficult. It's getting easier, but especially when new consoles arrived and the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 were both new, they were very different. And before that, I would say that the PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and the GameCube were even more different. You know, they were that decade of game development was very challenging in that you had different specs. I mean, you could just do. I mean, from a sound perspective, you could load way more sound into memory on the Xbox than you could on the PlayStation 2. On the PlayStation 2, after your streaming buffers were eating up memory, you had about 1.4, maybe 1.5 megabytes of loaded sound in those games at any given time. And you know, that's incredibly small. I don't know if people realize how small it is. So you end up doing a lot of different tricks in order to make it all fit into memory. Whereas on the Xbox, I remember having 8 megs, which was huge. And then eventually I used their system Exact, which was streaming off their hard drive, because the original Xbox, every Xbox had a hard drive, and it made life easier because I could just do this no latency streaming thing. Anyway, not to get too technical, but it was so different. And you would often have to play to the lowest common denominator. This was an industry problem. Moving into the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 era, it became even more different, to the point where on the original Force Unleashed, a developer called Chrome Studios in Australia was actually making the Wii and PlayStation 2 version, while the internal studio, and the PSP version, while the internal studio at LucasArts focused on the 360 and PS3 version. So they were the same story, a lot of the same art assets, a lot of the same gameplay ideas, but they were being driven. Actually, I don't even know. I can't even say art assets, but a lot of the same idea was being driven by 2 completely different teams in order to come to the market at the same time.
Yeah, they're definitely a little bit different. Like, for example, the Wii one and the PSP one, they have a lot of stuff happens in the Jedi Temple where you fight different Sith. Yeah. You also have, like, the beginning level is at night rather than during the day, where you're on Kashyyyk, and all, like, the DLC, well, not all of it, but a lot of it's included on the Wii and PSP ones to make it, I'm assuming it's there to make it something bigger, so though it doesn't look as good, it's still a game that's worth buying. Right.
Yeah, they're very, very different. And some of those differences were, I guess, by design to kind of give more value to, or different value to some of these other consoles, And one thing that was different, the Jedi Temple stuff was all added in the Wii version, and a lot of the Cloud City stuff as well. What's a Lobot,
Yes.
I worked on pretty much all of them. I went to Australia a couple times, and I worked with the guys at Chrome Studios. And so, it was a huge undertaking, and that's one of the reasons why I had so much help, is that I was going around listening to all the different versions and recording dialogue for all the different versions. And one thing that's really interesting about the original Force Unleashed is that there was a scene that was cut just because of time. I mean, that's the other thing, is that these things are under development. So much stuff gets cut and changed that the public never sees. But there was a scene that was cut out of our version that actually made it into the PlayStation 2 and Wii version, which is a scene where Juno Eclipse starts talking about Felucia, saying it reminds me of how this planet Kalos and how it used to look. And you kind of learn about her backstory and why she's helping this guy and the second thoughts she's having about the Empire. And basically her entire character arc was kind of established in this scene, so it was a heartbreaking cut. It's in the novel too, but it's not in
the
our
Sean
game.
Williams book. He told us about that actually a year ago, and some of the stuff that he's able to put in there is, you just like, why isn't this in the game? But I understand that there's a lot of resources that you put in the game, and you need to make a game that works rather than a game that has every last bit that you want in there.
Yeah, and a lot of cuts are great. Like, it makes you're cutting to make things stronger. You cut things to make a more concentrated, more strong experience. You're trimming the fat. In that particular case, I just don't think we had time to get it done, and we had to make a difficult decision. That decision was a bit over my head, but I do remember protesting and thinking it was really sad, because of all of the crew on the Rogue Shadow, they all had a very long character arc, even Proxy, of course, who I love, but they all have this really long character arc, and with the exception of Juno in that version of the game. You don't really understand Juno. She's just kind of like arm candy, which is, we really didn't want her to be at all. We wanted her to be this, basically the hotshot mechanic pilot. She led this Black Ops mission under Vader's command. She was reassigned, and under to this top secret project because she was so successful, and she's having second thoughts because she unwittingly, as a result of her success, led this raid on this innocent planet and destroyed it, and it's been eating her up inside. And so all of these people are trying to find redemption. That was the core of the game. The core of the story was about redeeming your past. That was what everyone was trying to do, even Proxy to an extent. And it was just a real shame that one ended up getting cut. But for people who read the book or played the Wii version, they kind of got a little bit more about Juno.
Yeah, that's one advantage I have of the Wii version. You get more story, which is good for me, because it doesn't look as pretty by far. So I guess one last question before we wrap up. I guess the next question is, now you work for Sony, and you've been working with games such as PlayStation All-Stars, God of War Ascension, Saints Row 3. Uncharted, and so on. So, as to quote one of our listeners, what can you tell us about your Sony overlords to get people excited about the next generation, like PlayStation 4? Undoubtedly, you're working on games for the PlayStation 4 right now because it comes out in November.
Sure.
What can you tell us about what's coming up to really get us excited to go into the next generation of games, and we'll jump in with both feet?
Well, I think the first thing is that Sony has been really great. You mean about the PlayStation 4 or just about games in general?
Well, games in general for Sony, but PlayStation 4, if you can, because I'm assuming that's what you're probably working on right now, since that's what's coming out in November.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, one thing that. And if you have any PC gamers that listen, I mean, people who build gaming PCs know that you're constantly upping the specs on those things and spending a lot of money in order to have the latest and greatest of everything, motherboards and video cards and RAM, memory, everything, and consoles, home consoles are a fixed hardware spec, right? So a game like The Last of Us was done on a machine that is a fixed hardware spec that came out in 2006. It was 2006, right? Fall of 06?
Yeah, 2006.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you consider that they're still putting out games that look like that, sound like that, and play like that on a machine that's that old, the PlayStation 4 is just so much more powerful than the PlayStation 3 in that it can do. And I think what people are going to discover is that this console is going to have legs for a long time, and certainly I'm not a Sony spokesperson per se, but just looking at it and seeing the games that are in development, I mean, they just look absolutely gorgeous, and Sony has just become such a wonderful place to work in terms of supporting new ideas, fresh ideas, and very cinematic ideas. I mean, infamous Second Son, which I'm not working on, but my colleagues are, looks amazing. There's a lot of launch titles that look great. Of course, all the indie developers that they've been announcing and embracing that scene as well, especially after the success of Journey and the Unfinished Swan, which I did get to work on the Unfinished Swan. Actually, that was really fun. I went and recorded Terry Gilliam for that, and if you haven't checked out the Unfinished Swan, please do. I know a lot of people played Journey, but they're both these nice little gems that came out of Santa Monica Studios. Games like Sound Shapes, these smaller titles that are just so addicting and fun and so interesting and unique, and they're kind of pushing the genres of the industry. I mean, Sony's really embracing that. And then, of course, you have these huge games like Killzone and Infamous, and it's kind of the best of everything and limitless sort of almost magic possibilities. When you look at it, you're just like, how did they do that? It's just an exciting time to be a gamer, and I think that there's going to be a lot of variety on the PlayStation 4, and it's going to have long legs. There's going to be we're just scratching the surface, I think, and this is just my opinion, having seen the thing. We're just scratching the surface of what this is going to do and what we're going to see over the next better part of a decade more. Who knows?
Okay. Thank you for that. I could talk to you for hours about sound, but I know you have a schedule, and I don't know if our listeners want to hear us talk for hours and hours and hours at one time.
Well, I love talking about this stuff, so it's my pleasure. Seriously, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about stuff I love, so thank you.
And thank you for appearing on the show, because I know one of my favorite interviews ever on Rebel Force Radio is the one in April with you where you talked about the end of LucasArts. And that's actually one of the few episodes I have permanently saved on my computer because I just love that interview.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And I got to say, that was a tough one. It wasn't a tough, those guys are great, but it was tough in that people were still really hurting over that, and talking about it. I mean, the Facebook activity and the emails that went around and the LinkedIn stuff, and, a lot of really good people lost their jobs. And look, regardless of its history, I wrote an article at Star Wars Insider that kind of said the same thing, regardless of stumbles in recent years, LucasArts has a 30-year legacy that is so unique in gaming and covers so many different genres, and it invented so many different genres that it's such an important part of the history of video games. and to see it close its doors is sad. No matter how many Star Wars Demolitions we put out. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I mean, it was a tough interview, so I appreciate that. It means a lot.
And so I guess the last question I have, which is the same question we ask every single guest we ever have on the show. We're going to give you a chance to have the soapbox to promote anything you'd like to promote, be it an upcoming convention appearance. You've been at Celebrations, all of them, the last 3, 4?
Yeah, 5, I think.
5.
Yeah.
And you work on games. So we're going to give you an opportunity to plug whatever you'd like to plug. The soapbox is yours. You can plug whatever you'd like or talk about whatever you'd like, be it to the fans, be it to, anyone you want to. Soapbox is yours.
Wow, the soapbox is mine. Well, first of all, if anyone, if anyone's curious about, I guess what I'm up to or any of that, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter is @DavidWCollins. I would say definitely check out The Last of Us if you haven't. There are a lot of really great games out there, like Journey and the Unfinished Swan in recent years that we worked on that are really, really great. The PlayStation 4 is coming out in the fall. Check it out, definitely. We're working on a great game called Knack right now with Japan Studios. They're amazing. We as in Sony. I just can't wait to play that. I think Mark Cerny's a genius. If you get a chance, check out a little documentary called Return of the Jedi. It's on StarWars.com. It's also on YouTube. Directed by Kyle Newman. I co-produced and did sound for that, as well as a web series that I mixed with Orlando Jones, Deanna Russo, and Eric Roberts called Tainted Love. That's on Machinima Prime. Check that out. That was really fun to mix, and it's the first time I've ever mixed a web series that's, your target mix platform is a smartphone or a tablet or something like that. But check that out, and thanks for listening. Oh, and of course, if you haven't played Republic Commando or Force Unleashed, go!
Yes, go play it. Thank you, David, for being on.
Sure. Hey, just curious, where can I find the show in terms of, is it streaming somewhere, or is it?
We're on Stitcher, on iTunes. Easiest way to find us, though, is www.bombadradio.com.
Oh, of course. Okay. And then, what's your? Boy, you must have quite a few listeners here. I'm looking at your website here. Okay.
Well, it depends on the episode, but yeah, we get we had R.A. Salvatore on a few weeks ago. We've had Tom Kane. We get.
Oh yeah. No, you guys have some amazing podcasts here. I'm looking at this. Steve Stanton, and I'm like, yeah, I was looking at this earlier, going, God, I got to start listening to this show. There's so many podcasts I want to listen to in so little time. But this is great. Well, thanks so much for the invite. I really appreciate it.